All right, so let's see. We had a completely unnecessary snow day last Thursday, so we all missed another class, which I'm sure you are not heartbroken over, because education is the one thing where consumers are happy with less, as I've said multiple times. The less you get, the happier you are. But that doesn't mean that I will have to be like Sherman marching to Atlanta to get caught up, or the schedule, stay on track so that we're roughly on track with the online class, because of course there are no snow days if you're online, right? And you can do it anywhere. So the asynchronous class is a little bit ahead of us, so I have to get caught up. We have a new student that joined the class last Tuesday, was supposed to be here Thursday, and obviously didn't make it because class started like right after this class was it 11 o'clock?
Yeah.
So I just barely missed my 9:30 class. Happy days for me. But anyway, so you should come up, tell the class your name and 3 wonderful attributes about you so that they can decide whether or not they want to have you in their group. You gotta get a group.
We're not scared people from us. We're all just half asleep. I just think right here.
Yep, or wherever. Just tell them your name and we'll see which group wants to take you on.
My name's Eric Flippin.
Your 3 greatest strengths.
3 greatest strengths. Great communicator, hard worker, and
That's another man I failed. Sorry, you gotta come up with something other than your hard worker.
time efficient.
Okay.
Leadership.
Okay, which group wants it?
We'll take.
Okay, all right. So you'll be with this group. You'll have to remind me at the end of class to add him to your group.
You'll be power.
That's all right.
Okay.
It's fine.
We will
So-
honor the vote. Our group is, this will be a dictatorship soon.
So, according to my notes, that I take copious notes, right? So remind me to add him to your group. We talked about subjectivism, which is the idea that there are no a priori truths that we can discern from the rational mind. And I told you the problem with this is that we can find at least 3 universal truths, just as a way of sort of getting us back to where we should be, that have existed among all people at all places and all times. And those are the prohibition against killing members of the in-group, the prohibition against stealing from members of the in-group, the prohibition against lying against members of the in-group. And there are more that we can find, I think, with the rational mind, if we simply think about it in terms of the Platonic sense of what it means to think very critically about things. And we'll talk about Socrates a little bit more in this class period as we talk about what his idea of justice is. The second challenge, and this is the one that seems really intuitively appealing, is called cultural relativism. And last time I talked about something called legal positivism. And the idea is, and I told you that the former Chief Justice of the United States, who is dead, his name is William Rehnquist, he died on the bench and he was replaced by John Roberts, was a fan of this theory of legal positivism. And it seems nice because I did tell you that we tend to criminalize things that we find morally abhorrent. So forever and ever and ever in this country, until a case called Bowers versus, Lawrence and Gardner versus Texas, we criminalized homosexual sodomy, right? So the idea is that we put our moral imprimatur on this idea that gay relations were wrong. And in Lawrence and Gardner versus Texas, the court said, it violates the equal protection and due process clauses to do that. And it really created a lot of turmoil in our political culture. Now, it is amazing to me how quickly we got over that, and how quickly, right after Lawrence and Gardner versus Texas, the Supreme Court went ahead and legalized, even though the same justice who wrote the decision in the Obergefell case also wrote the decision in Lawrence and Gardner versus Texas, and that was a guy named Anthony Kennedy, no relation to the Kennedys that were from Massachusetts that became a political dynasty through several United States senators, congressmen, but has the same, shares the same name. Anthony Kennedy wrote the opinion in Lawrence and Gardner versus Texas, and then again in the Obergefell decision, and ultimately the case that legalized gay marriage. So, what William Rehnquist says is that the law is all we can know, really, and that is the highest form of morality, because we can be certain with the law. All of these others things seem to be very uncertain when we talk about ethics, but we can be certain of the law, and so isn't that the highest and best morality? So, according to cultural relativists, morality is culturally specific, and this is intuitively appealing to business students, particularly because as we have engaged more and more in international trade, companies have said, look, in order to do business in these places that we want to do business, we have to abide by their laws and respect their culture. So I can give you an example of an argument that was made to me as an attorney that was like this. I had a business client that asked me if they could refuse to hire a woman for a buyer's position that was in China. Now, these people are hard to come by the way. I mean, if you can speak Mandarin, you can get a job as an international buyer, and you can make quite a bit of money. So this company that I worked for, that I had a contract with, called me and they said, look, we put out an ad for a buyer, and the requirements of the buyer's position were that you had to have an MBA, you had to speak Mandarin, and you had to have 7 years experience in purchasing. And the top candidate that applied for this job was a female. And I said, well, and it turns out this female was from mainland China. So obviously she spoke Chinese. She had experience as a buyer. She had about 10 years experience, which was more than the minimum. And she had the MBA. And I said, what's the problem? And they said, well, it's a very patriarchal society, and men won't respect her. And so we don't want to hire her. And I said, I think you're stuck. I think, if you want to be on the right side of the law on this. And they said, the problem is that in the business we're in, they expect to go out. Lots of deals are done over drinks in China. I don't know if this is true or not. This is just what my clients told me. I have to admit, I've never been to China. It's one of the few places I've never ever been. And they won't treat her the same way. And part of the thing is that we don't want to subject her to sexual harassment, because when they go out, a lot of times they go to karaoke bars, and these are really fronts for prostitution. I don't know if that's true. I'm taking them at their word that this is the case, right? And they said, isn't there something called a bona fide occupational qualification? This is in the EEOC's BFOQ. So you can make out a prima facie case for discrimination. An employer can then assert an affirmative defense to that prima facie case with the EEOC. And one of the affirmative defenses that they can come up with is something called a bona fide occupational qualification, a BFOQ. This has been really limited. So for example, no one would seriously claim that you had to hire a man, that you had to let a man audition and had to hire him as an actor for a female role. That's a BFOQ. You have a part in a romantic comedy that calls for a female role. You don't have to let men fill the role, even if they're the greatest leading actor on the planet and they look fantastic in drag. You don't have to let them fill the role. And I don't know if you all watch Saturday. Does anybody watch Saturday Night Live?
What? I started.
You watched last Saturday's. Who was the host of last Saturday's Saturday Night Live?
Oh, cross-dresser guy.
Yeah, his name is RuPaul.
Yeah.
When he is not in drag, he's a bald African American. He's like freakishly tall. I think he's like 6'3" or 6'4" or something like that. He looks like a bald African American male but when he's in drag, he looks like a woman, doesn't he? I mean, like if you've seen him in drag, he looks like a woman. Nobody would say you have to let RuPaul play the part, right? Rather than Jennifer Aniston. And I said, so, this is a very limited affirmative defense. It has to be an essential function of the job, and the job that you posted had these three requirements, and she meets the essential functions of this job. This is not playing a part. No one would seriously argue that you have to let a man be a pole dancer at night trips. But that's not what you're advertising for. What you're advertising for is somebody who can speak Chinese, has an MBA, and has experience in purchasing. You have that. And the BFOQ has been very limited. And in fact, there's a case that's very much on point with what you're telling me. And it is actually the Southwest Airlines case. Southwest Airlines was known as the love airline. And to this day, one of their icons on their planes is a heart on the Southwest. If you look at the tail, where the tail numbers are on the aircraft, they have a big heart on the tail. And they started out as a completely regional airline. They only flew in Texas. That's how Southwest started out. They flew businessmen who were in the oil business, or as we say in Oklahoma and Texas, all business. That's BIDDNESS. That's how George W. Bush, our former president, pronounced it, all business. When he was governor of Texas, George W. Bush, in his State of the State address one year, said, the business of business is business. And the business of the Texas legislature is to take care of business, TCB, taking care of business. I have no idea what that means, but whatever. So Southwest Airlines only flew between Dallas and Boston and Houston originally. That was what they did. And they basically were a airline that catered to business people's needs who needed to fly in that region. Then they expanded, and they are now obviously an airline that flies both nationally and internationally. So Southwest Airlines argued that they could only hire females as flight attendants, or what we used to call back in the day when this case came up, stewardesses. Right? That's what we used to call them. We now have non-gender or gender-neutral names for everything. You no longer have waitresses and waiters. You have, I will be your server today, right? So Southwest Airlines said we can only have stewardesses because we cater to businessmen who are taking care of business in the state of Texas. And they just feel so much more comfortable with a woman taking care of them. And the court looks at the essential functions of the job and says, no, that's not a BFOQ. Because what are the essential functions of a flight attendant? Well, you all probably think the essential functions of a flight attendant are to bring you a drink and throw peanuts at you, or whatever it is that they are now serving or not serving, depending on the flight, and how long it is. You know, I mean, the first time I went flying there, they had full meals on the plane that they brought to you. Even if you weren't in first class, they had a full, they would serve you a lunch if you were on an, or a breakfast. Don't do that, right? And the court says no. And that's what Southwest argued. The essential functions of the job are to serve people drinks, and they just feel so much more comfortable with a woman than they will with a man. And the court says, no, you're required by the FAA to have these people. And their essential functions are to provide safety. They're not there really to provide drinks. Now I will tell you that 99.999% of a flight attendant's time is taken up by serving you drinks and throwing peanuts at you, right? But that's not why they're required to be there, and they're required. What is their essential functions? Well, they're supposed to give you that stupid safety briefing at the beginning of the flight that says, and honestly, it used to be really dumb because they're like, how to buckle a seatbelt. There are actually people that you don't remember. Seatbelts on planes used to be what seatbelts in back cars look like. That's not what they look like anymore because there's a problem with that. But they tell you how to buckle the seatbelt in case you don't know how to buckle a seatbelt. What else do? They tell you where the exits are. And yes, and if the plane should lose pressurization, these oxygen masks will fall from the overhead area, and you're supposed to do what? You're supposed to put one on yourself first, and then help any small children or, frail elderly or whatever it is that needs help with the oxygen mask. And why do they want you to do yours first? That seems enormously selfish that they would want you to put your oxygen mask on first before you save your life. I think the instant reaction of most parents, if you've ever had children, I've never had children, I told you that. I don't like children, they make me nervous. So I never had any. I start breaking out in hives if I have to be in the same room with a small child. But I admit I'm in the minority on that. But most parents, I think their instant reaction would be to save their kid before they save themselves. But that's not what they want you to do. And why is it they want you to put your oxygen mask on first before you help your kid?
So you don't pass out.
So you don't pass out. Yeah. The idea is that if you're helping the kid and you don't have your oxygen mask and they lose cabin pressure, you can pass out. And there you and then you'd be no use to either yourself or the kid, right? So put your own oxygen. That's the essential functions of the flight attendant. So this is not a BFOQ. Now, business people like this argument about cultural relativism because they want to engage in maybe ethically suspect, like we don't want to hire women to be buyers for companies that engage in business in China for whatever reason. And so they want to argue, and from a moralistic standpoint, they'll say, look, that's the culture. We shouldn't say anything about the culture. The problem with cultural relativism is, again, one of the similarities that we have with subjectivism is that we can find at least 3 prohibitions amongst all societies that apply at all places at all times. And if you think about it, this prohibition against women serving in these roles is really about discrimination, and discrimination not based on anything that is logically relevant to things. Now, one of the arguments that businesses will make is men and women aren't equal. And so why should we treat them this way? The Chinese are just, if I take their argument as being truthful, they're just recognizing what we all know is that men and women aren't equal. Well, equality before the law and equality in jobs are not the same things. What is a BFOQ? Well, for example, a prison guard. In order to be a prison guard in a male prison, and I have a female friend who met this requirement, and she actually was a prison guard in a male prison. In order to be a prison guard in a male prison, you have to be able to drag a 175-pound bag of something, it's rocks or gravel or something, across a gym floor, the length of a gym floor. Now, what does this effectively do? Well, it eliminates most women from the job of being a prison guard in Oklahoma prisons, doesn't it? Because how many women can drag a 175-pound dummy across a gym floor? Not many, but I have a friend who can do this. That's a legitimate BFOQ, right? Because there is a nexus, there is a close connection between the requirement, which has what we call a disparate impact on women, and the essential functions of the job. Why is it that they say you have to be able to drag a 175-pound dummy across the gym floor? And actually, if you think about it, it probably should be more like 200 pounds, because the average male at the time that they came up with this BFOQ was 175 pounds. And if you're going to be a prison guard, you may have to drag somebody that distance in order to get them back in their cell, right? So that's a legitimate, it has a disparate impact, but it's got a close connection. This idea that we can't hire women, there's no close connection. Can she speak the language? Yes. Does she know about the terms of negotiation? Yes. Does she have the MBA? Yes. Does she have the experience? Yes. There's no real connection other than the prejudice of some people with regard to this job. Now, it's not that we shouldn't respect diversity. It's not, and this again seems intuitively appealing, because if we look at cultures, they do vary widely from place to place. They vary widely in the United States. We are fascinated with the death penalty in Oklahoma. We love it. We kill more people in Oklahoma, in our prisons, on death row than any other state except Texas. When George W. Bush was governor of Texas, he signed the death warrant for Harvey Lee Lucas, who had been convicted of a murder that had occurred at a time when he was serving a prison sentence in Georgia and could not have possibly committed the murder for which he confessed. He did confess to it. He was a serial liar. He confessed to literally hundreds of murders, including the murder of his mother and his high school English teacher, both of whom were very much alive at the time that he confessed. And Texas had no problem executing him, for a murder for which he absolutely could not have committed. If you go to New York, they've done away with the death penalty, as I understand it. Those touchy-feely, tree-hugging viney thumpers, don't have respect for the law. New Yorkers don't do the death penalty. We're fascinated with it here. We have cultural differences in this country, right? Mm-hmm. We think that if you commit murder, you should fry. We don't actually fry anything. We kill them by lethal injection. That's a cultural difference. Shouldn't we respect that difference? Shouldn't we be respectful? I mean, the fact that here the people, the sovereign state of Oklahoma says that we should be able to do this. We have a concept in this country called dual sovereignty. What does this mean? Well, we have, instead of one sovereign, we have two. The people of the state of Oklahoma, we have a national sovereignty and we have state sovereignty. And where they overlap, we call this concurrent powers. The people are sovereign in this country, but we have a federalist system, which means that we have 50 states. And shouldn't we respect this difference? Well, yeah, you should respect cultural differences in things like choice of forum, choice of language, those things which may be beyond morality or amoral, that don't have moral import. But with regard to things that have moral import, maybe we shouldn't be too quick to say, yeah, this cultural relativism is true. Again, there are 3 prohibitions that we can find amongst all societies and all places at all times, and we can find more and more that every society or the majority of societies are agreeing to. At least in theory, even communist China, which has horrible, horrible, horrible human rights abuse violations levied against it every year, has signed on to the Human Rights Treaty. And they pay lip service, at least, to the idea that you shouldn't engage in child labor, that you shouldn't engage in slave labor, which they engage in through their prison system, right? But at least in theory, they pay homage to these ideas. So cultural relativism seems attractive, but when it comes to morality, we can use the mind's eye to say, don't do that. It is a priori wrong. And you only have to think about this. If you said something like, put yourself in this position, I realize that this is going to be somewhat difficult for you all to do, since in Oklahoma we're also fascinated with Donald Trump. You know, Oklahomans overwhelmingly love Donald Trump. In China, Donald Trump's equivalent's name is Xi Jinping. And if you go out here, let's say in the equivalent of communist China, let's suppose you're a student in a university in communist China, which is not terribly communist, by the way, because there are lots of billionaires in China now, which seems to be antithetical to communism. But let's suppose that you go out into, we have 2 malls here on campus. We have a North Mall and a South Mall. They basically run the sidewalks that run from the eastern edge of campus to the western edge of campus. One right by the University Center. This one closest to the business building. Let's suppose you go out there and the equivalent of that in your university in China, and you start yelling at the top of your lungs, Xi Jinping is a brutal totalitarian dictator, which is probably true. Sure, you know? I mean, he's a brutal totalitarian dictator, and he needs to pay the price. Power to the people. That's what you say. You're not going to stay around for very long, right? Like you're going to, bad things are going to happen to you. Now, I realize that most people are fascinated by Donald Trump in this state, but let's suppose that you do the same thing here. You go out and you start saying, Donald Trump is a crook. He's letting his children run amok and take advantage of the presidency. He's benefiting from his name in foreign deals. I mean, Ivanka Trump had 130 trademark applications in communist China before her father became president, and they were not being granted. And all of a sudden, lo and behold, when her daddy becomes president, all of those trademark applications were suddenly granted. That's a violation of the Emoluments Clause. He should be impeached and removed. Power to the people. If you do that, while your fellow students in Oklahoma might shout you down, the police are not going to come and arrest you and drag you off to the gulag. That's not going to happen. And I think you don't have to experience this to know that it's wrong if that happens to you. We don't have to actually experience being dragged off to the gulag to know that that's just crazy. Now, that is the way the majority of the countries in the world operate, but that does not make it right? So we should respect diversity, but we have to be able to draw lines, and we do. It is called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, by the way, people. something that American businesses don't like because they say it hampers our ability. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act says you cannot bribe foreign officials to get your way in a country. Other countries allow their companies to do that. Bribery is rampant in no longer communist Russia. Right? Russia has given up communism and they realize that they're not communist anymore. But if you want to get things done in Russia, you have to bribe the right people. The right people being friends of Vlad or Vlad himself. And our law says don't do that. Right? That's not acceptable. It's not morally correct. This one does not seem to be true, but the more you think about it, it's the one that is the hardest of the three challenges to philosophical ethics to deal with. It's called psychological egoism. Now, what psychological egoism, I put on there on the first bullet point that this is a deterministic philosophy. What does determinism say? Well, determinism says that either as a result of nature or nurture or a combination of the two, that you cannot help but do the things that you do. You respond in very predictable ways to stimuli, and you can't really help it. And there's a marketer who buys into this idea. He's written a book. He's not an academic in marketing. He's what we call a practitioner in marketing. And he wrote a book called Biology, Byology. His name is Martin Lindstrom. I think I mentioned him before. And it's not biology, guy. It's B-U-Y, as in the science of why we buy the things that we buy. And Lindstrom is a determinist. He says, look, we say that we have free will, but we really don't. One of the things that he points to are these studies that we use in marketing on using fMRI technology. And one of my colleagues, when I was in the doctoral program, we actually had an fMRI machine at New Mexico State that was purchased by the marketing department and the psychology department to do these kinds of studies. And I think I alluded to this before. There are all of these non-smoking ads, right, that have come out. Did you watch any of these? The one with the guy in the wheelchair who's all gray and pasty, and it goes through the smoking, companies. Philip Morris will tell you that smoking is cool, that it'll make you more attractive, that all the popular people do it, but would you do it if you ended up like me? And one of the things that we know from looking at the fMRI technology is that when we put smokers in those machines and watch what happens to the brain activity as they watch these ads, is the pleasure part of the brain is what's firing. The part of the brain that senses pleasure is what's firing when they're playing these ads. So smokers on surveys will say, oh, that ad terrified me. I want to quit smoking right now. And then they run out to the parking lot and light up just as fast as they can get out of the building. And so Lindstrom says, look, we really can't help but react the way we do. Free will is illusory. Let's try an experiment. The people in biology, not biology, B-U-Y, but B-I-O-L-O-G-Y, would be horrified at my simplification of genetics. But let's try a genetic experiment in this class. Genetically, women are what? You should remember. How many of you have had biology? Yeah, chromosomes. They're XX, right? Yeah, biologically, women are XX, and biologically, what makes a man a man? There is a Y chromosome. And what actually determines whether or not you have the Y chromosome? Is it the ovum, or is it the sperm that determines that? Men determine. Yeah, the sperm determines the gender, right, of the child. So Henry VIII kept executing his wives because they couldn't give him a son. He had one son that died very early, but he kept having babies that were female. Turns out, well, old Henry, that's his problem, not theirs, but they didn't know that at the time, right? So I want everyone who has a Y chromosome to raise their hand. Everyone who has a Y chromosome, raise your hand. Oh my gosh. Now you all think you had free will, don't you? But you all raised your hand. I told you to raise your hand. Why did you raise your hand?
The next one chromosome.
Yeah, but you could have sat on your hand. You didn't have to raise your hand. Why did you raise your hand? Psychological egos would say, well, you raised your hand because I asked a question and you responded to a stimuli in a very predictable way. Why did you do it? Well, because you wanted to, or you think you wanted to.
We've been taught.
You've been
In
taught.
kindergarten to raise your hand.
Yes, you've been taught, exactly. You have been programmed from a very early age to do what the teacher says to do, right? You've been taught, raise your hand. If teacher asks a question, do what the teacher says. Or maybe you did it because if you sat on your hand, because you know that in college, I don't have the same kind of power over you that they have in primary and secondary education. People would look at you. Don't know. Questioning, right? They might think less of you. So you did it. So psychological egos say, we can't really control the way we act. Now you think you can. Let's think about this. I just got you all to raise your hand. Maybe you say, well, you tricked me. I didn't know that this was, part of this was a trick, right? Let's think about something more difficult. Can you will yourself to not want? I told you all that I have this little competition, and it's probably a competition only in my mind, with the associate dean of the College of Business, Jeff Willis, who also dresses like I think business people should dress. But forever and ever and ever, my style was bow tie, French cuff shirts, Allen Edmonds shoes. He's now started doing that. I think as a result of seeing me. In fact, I was the one who had to teach him, I think, how to tie a bow tie. And all of a sudden, and now, so I've got to up the game. But I actually think that Jeff is one of the few people that dresses like a business professor should dress. I mean, we've got lots of people, God help us, that wear jeans to teach him. I've even seen one of my colleagues in the summer come in shorts, much to my horror and dismay. So I like Allen Edmonds shoes. I think I have 8 pairs now, currently. Every time I buy them, I think that I have free will, but do I? Can you will yourself to not want the shoes?
Yeah.
You think you can?
I've done it.
Willed yourself to not want the shoes?
Mm-hmm.
Willed yourself to not want them? Or did you just not buy them?
No, I willed myself towards a different direction, which is not purchasing them.
But did you still want them?
No,
One,
not
one
realistically.
need. Yeah.
After a couple months, fade now.
But you didn't will yourself to want that either, right? You wanted something else more than you wanted the shoes. You wanted the money and
Not really. The money went to rent.
So you needed the money for rent. I mean, I selfishly wanted to not be homeless, but you didn't will yourself to want that either. I mean, that's a classic determinist, right? I cannot buy all of the shoes that I want because at some point I have to pay my bills, right? I didn't will myself to want that. That's a need, and you have to respond to those needs. For a determinist, they would say, look, you wanted something more. If I don't buy the Allen Edmonds shoes and there's a new pair that I want, I haven't bought them yet, it's not that I will myself to not want them, it's that I want something else more. And what is it that I want? Well, in your case, it was you wanted to pay rent more than you wanted the shoes or whatever it was that you wanted, but you didn't control that either. Now, what's wrong with this thing? And what psychological egos will say is that people always act in their own self-interest. that we are very predetermined to take care of ourselves. And so then, of course, the argument comes like, well, what about Mother Teresa? You all probably don't even know who Mother Teresa is, because I think she died before many of you were born. Mother Teresa dedicated her life. How many of you know who she is?
Is that another thing?
Yeah. She dedicated her life to helping the poorest among us. People who were rejected by their society in Calcutta. This seems like the ultimate altruism, but for psychological egoists, they'd say, no, she was just doing what she really wanted to do because she was inspired by God. And you wouldn't want to, I mean, if God, now I really love these people who tell me that Jesus told them to do something. Really walked right in, sat down on your bed and had this conversation with you, much like the Reverend James Robertson of Texas, who has conversations with God that he records. God told the Reverend Robertson, he has the largest megachurch in Dallas, by the way, or did at one time. And he lives in Fort Worth and commutes back and forth to Dallas. And on the highway, God apparently told James, you're praying with a greater maturity, James. And he said, I do not understand, Lord. And God responded, you like so many others. I mean, like, okay. But Mother Teresa was called by God to do this work. And you wouldn't want to deny God, would you? That's not really her free will. She's really doing what she wants. Perhaps she got good feelings out of this, right? I mean, she felt good about doing this. This is exemplified by Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, who wrote a book called Leviathan. He was giving alms to some poor people in England, and a minister ran up to him and said, would you have not done that other than it was required or called to you by God? And Hobbes, who was not a big believer, said, yes, because in easing their suffering, it doth, and Hobbes was a very much a determinist, it doth ease me. In other words, altruism is really nothing more than saying, there but for the grace of God, go I. Any one of us could be homeless. Why are you sitting in this classroom listening to me lecture you about Thomas Hobbes and Socrates and all these other people? It's not because you have any real great interest in it. It's because you have to, if you're a marketing student, you have to take this class. It is required that you take this class. And you want that piece of paper that says you're educated and that will allow you to go out and get a good job. Because you know, and students often ask me now, my younger friends' children will say things like, I just don't think I'm going to go to college because it's expensive. It's not worth it. I know lots of college graduates that don't have jobs. Yeah, they're called musical theater majors, right? But it used to be when my mother graduated, my grandmother had a master's degree. That was very unusual. She had a master's degree. And at that time, less than 1% of women had any kind of postgraduate degree. To this day, if you get a bachelor's degree, you are in the educational elite of our country. What percentage of students now attempt college? When I graduated from college, I will tell you, it was about 50% attempted some form of post-secondary education. That number has dropped precipitously. And why has it dropped? Well, because when my grandmother got a master's degree, that meant you were guaranteed a job. If you could do that, if you had any kind of college, you could get a job. When my mother graduated from college, if you got a bachelor's degree, that meant you automatically were going to get a job. In this day and age, a bachelor's degree doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get job. What I can tell you and what I tell my friends' children is that if you don't go to college, I can guarantee your chances of becoming middle class are next to none. It used to be that a college education guaranteed you middle class status. It doesn't anymore. What I can guarantee you is that if you don't have it, your chances of getting there are slightly better than zero, but not much better than zero, right? So why are you here listening to me lecture to you about this stuff? Well, because you want something. You want the grade that's going to get you to the point where you get the degree that then you can take out to an employer and say, I am educated. And you're doing that because you're selfish. And I don't mean this in a bad way. Being selfish in this instance is a good thing, isn't it? Because you're doing this ensures that you're going to do what? That you're not going to be somebody who's starving to death, out panhandling, taking up resources from the state, getting a handout through food stamps or housing assistance. I mean, this is good. But psychological egos would say that we always act in our own self-interest. Well, what's wrong with this argument? There are a number of things wrong with this argument. First of all, psychological egoism is what we call, and it is a determinist philosophy, but it is also completely self-contained in its own philosophy, and that it has an answer for everything. And to say that people always do something, this always happens. When we talk about human beings, it's not like chemical reactions, where if you combine chemical X with chemical Y, you always get the same thing in a test tube, right? If we take a test tube and we combined, how many of you did this when you were in grade school? You made these little volcanoes. How many of you did this when you were in grade school? I did this. You make a volcano and you put baking soda in the tube of the volcano, and you put a little dye maybe on the baking soda, like red dye, and then you pour vinegar. I think it's vinegar, isn't it? Is that right? You pour vinegar into the baking soda, and what happens to your little model volcano? It goes, right? When you do that experiment, you always get the same result. The people are not that way. We can't say for certainty people always do this. So to claim that people always behave in a certain way, that they always act in their own self-interest, is highly suspect from a logical standpoint, because people do lots of things. What's another problem with psychological egoism? Well, this idea that people always act in their own self-interest engages in the logical fallacy, and we talked about this, of assuming causation by mere succession in time. Because, and it also engages in the logical fallacy of equivocation. Because I help my neighbor out, my neighbor has a problem, and I help him out, the fact that I feel good about helping him out does not mean that that is the motivation for helping him out. It's equivocating, right? The motivation has nothing to do with the feelings that follow from it. The third problem is that if we take psychological egoism, again, like cultural relativism or subjectivism, we could never say people are morally culpable. And that's just, I mean, we can say there are bad people and that they are morally culpable and that they could help. We know that people have some understanding of the differences between right and wrong. So what do all of these three have in common that you should know for an exam? Problems associated with challenges to ethics. It allows for exceptionalism. What does that mean? It allows me to say I am exceptional and therefore beyond moral reproach, or my group, in the case of cultural relativism, we are culturally, it's our culture that matters, right? In a highly connected world, that might have been acceptable, and this leads to what we call fear of the other. Fear of the other maybe was at one point in time a sort of natural self-preservation motivation, but as we've connected with, we can't have that. It's not based on reason. In other words, it's totally emotive. I had a colleague who, if he fell asleep in her class, when we used to have chalkboards, she retired before we got these horrible dry erase boards, which I think should be thrown out. Dry erase boards are just a nightmare for a number of reasons, not the least of which is my students can't read my handwriting. They can read my handwriting on chalkboard because it's slower. On a dry erase board, it's slick and you can't read it. But we used to have these chalkboards in classrooms and they had big, heavy erasers. Do you remember this from your grade school days? These big, heavy erasers. And if you fell asleep in her class, her name's Beverly Thornton, she'd just throw an eraser at your head. And I had students when I used to be associate general counsel that would complain about this, fancy that. And I asked her, why do you do that to them? Because I felt like it. They were pissing me off. Shouldn't fall asleep in class. Well, that's not going to work, right? I mean, no, we can't allow people to say I felt this way. So I felt like if you fell asleep in my class, I have a concealed carry permit, and I'm just gonna just take out my 357 and smite you right there. You won't fall asleep in my class anymore. Well, you'll be dead.
Yeah, well,
But I got news for you. Nobody else is gonna fall asleep in class, right? It's only gonna take one. It's only gonna take one of you little people, and that problem's solved. News travels fast. RateMyProfessor.com. Right? That Aguirre character shoots people if you fall asleep. And don't take him if you're gonna fall asleep in class. We can't do that. It's not universally applicable. So what are the qualifications for a valid ethical theory? Well, they are that it must be based on reason, based on logic. It has to allow for the developments of principles that can be applied in all places at all times. And it has to be, as a result, universally applicable, right? So these are the three things. Based on reason, allows for the development of principles. Yeah, it did. These are the elements of a valid ethical theory. It's based on rational analysis, allows for the development of principles based on that analysis. And how you develop those principles, we'll talk about, and it's universally applicable. So what is a valid ethical theory? Well, the first, and I'm going to stop this for 1 minute because it's going to go on. Who is the first person to come up with a valid ethical theory or a body of philosophy? So we talked about at the beginning of this class the three great questions that philosophy answers. What are those questions?
The question of knowledge.
The question of knowledge. What is it I can know and how can I know it? This is not trivial, right? So how can I know this? The question of conduct and the question of governance. Those are the three great questions that philosophy attempts to answer. So you don't have to answer these questions using philosophy. How can you answer these questions? You can use mythology to answer these questions. What is mythology? When we think about mythology, how many of you had humanities? You should remember this. What's a mythology?
Like a cultural way of telling things.
Okay. It usually is associated with a deity, right? Or deities, right? Yeah, I mean, so we think of the ancient Greeks as having what we would call now a false religion, right? That's a mythology. So you can answer these questions using a mythology. You can answer these questions using theology, which we would now consider a valid religion. What are the great religions that are currently alive that are not dead? So mythologies are generally dead religions, like the ancient Greeks. What are the great religions of the world? There are 7 of them. Let's see if I can get this right. 3 of them are born of one. So the monotheistic religions are all born of Judaism, which is the oldest of the monotheistic religions. And actually, Jews didn't start out as monotheistic. They were what we call henotheistic. What does that mean? They believe that the people around them all worship these different gods, and they believe that there were gods, but your God was somewhat territorially specific, and you also believed as a henotheist that you worship the only God that was worthy of worship, right? And we know from the stories of the Bible that the Jews did not always do this, right? Like the golden calf, remember they worshiped the people, and all of a sudden, they're worshiping the golden calf again. So Jews started out as henotheistic. They became monotheistic, which means that they believe in one God, the only true God, right? Out of Judaism, the second religion that was born out of Judaism was Christianity. So for Christians, what my people call the Torah becomes the Old Testament. And what Christians now say is the teachings of Christ add to the Torah, the Old Testament, become a new covenant with God based on the teachings of Christ. And the third monotheistic religion to be born out of Judaism goes back to the story of Abraham. And Abraham has a wife. She's well past the menopause, doesn't have a child. And God has promised Abraham that he would be the king of a mighty nation, right? You all remember this from Sunday school? And his wife is beyond the menopause, so they can't have children. So God tells him to do what? Well, to elevate his wife's handmaid to provide him with children. Or God allows that, right? And who's the handmaid of his wife? Who's Abraham's wife? If I have my story correct. From my biblical history class. How many of you had Sunday school?
It's like on the tip of my tongue, I can't think of it.
Our only hope, Corpus.
You can
Yes.
Google
Sarah,
it.
right?
Sarah. Yeah, Sarah. So he elevates Sarah's handmaid, whose name is Hagar. If I think I have that correct. Is that right? Yeah. It's sounding familiar. They have a child. And then miraculously, Sarah gets pregnant with Isaac. And Isaac actually means he who laughs, because they laughed at God when God said, "We'll make you the father of my nation." Well, Sarah at this point becomes very jealous of her handmaid and doesn't want her child to inherit along with what she sees as the legitimate child. And so Abraham goes to God and asks him what to do, and God says, "Cast them out." This is a really horrible story. Lots of biblical stories are really horrible. It says, "Cast them out, but I promise you that I will make them, that branch of your seed, the father of a mighty nation as well." So Hagar and Ishmael are cast out. Isaac becomes the Jews, and Ishmael's line become the what? The Muslims, yeah. That becomes the Muslim line. So those are the three monotheistic religions. So there's three. Let's see if I can get the others. Buddhism, which I don't really consider religion, it's more of a philosophy, and it's usually combined because it doesn't have a deity associated with it. Usually it's combined with something else. Taoism, Hinduism. That's 6, right? So we've got Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism. I may have to come up with the 7th. I'm going to have to look it up and get back with you. But we've got 6 at least, right? So those are valid religions. That's one way you can answer this question of what is it I can know? How can I know it? What is it you can know? Well, you turn to the book, right? You turn to the book, you turn to the Bible, that tells you what you can know. And it's got a nice story about how the world came into being. That gives you a foundation. It gives you a code of conduct. So there are all kinds of rules and prohibitions. For example, in the Torah, there are thousands, literally thousands. I realize that Christians think there are 10. There are the 10 commandments that we have are the big ones, right? For Jews. There are lots of others. What are some of the other commandments that are set forth in the Torah for Jews and in the Old Testament for Christians? Well, lots of them. There are thousands of both negative and positive commandments. In Leviticus 18:20, if a man lies with another man as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination, their blood shall surely be upon them. Right? What else do we get out of Leviticus? It's an abomination to eat a shrimp. It's an abomination to wear linen and wool. So people who are completely devout, there's a whole person that does this in my religion. There's a person who looks at the collars of suits, since Jews are not allowed to wear linen and wool together. One of the things that most suit collars have is they're made out of wool. The outer lining is made out of wool, but linen is stiffer, and you want the collar to be stiffer, so a lot of suits have an inner lining that has linen. That's an abomination. Right? So we go to the book. So we can answer these questions either by a mythology, by a religion, which we would consider a valid theology, or we can answer these questions by philosophy. Why is this important? Well, what's the problem, obviously, with using a mythology? Well, we've said that doesn't work anymore. We don't believe in Zeus and Venus and all these other things. We've said that basis of our knowledge doesn't work anymore. What's the problem with using religion as the way that we answer these three great questions? Well, whose religion are we going to use? And if we get into just, let's say, Americans love this. They say we're a Christian nation. We should have our laws based on Christian principles. Well, we have a problem here. Which version? We used to have a congressman who wanted to, his name was Ernest Istook. We have lots of congressmen in Oklahoma that all want to put prayer back in school. But I was particularly fond of Ernie because Ernie was a Mormon. They don't like being called Mormons anymore. It's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And really, Ernie, do you think we're going to pray Mormon prayers in school, buddy? No. If we're going to base it on the majority in Oklahoma, we're all going to be praying what in school? What's the predominant? I don't think any religion in Oklahoma has a majority, but there is one that has a large plurality. What is a plurality? It's the largest number that you have if you don't have a majority, right? What's a majority? A majority is defined as 50% plus one, not 51%, 50% plus one. Right? So what's the largest plurality in Oklahoma are we going to find? Well, forever, I don't know what it is anymore, but when I was growing up, the largest denomination in Oklahoma was Southern Baptist. Yeah. And I think it still is, right? Although among your age group, it's non-denominational now. Most people are going out here to Life Cult or some other, equally vapid. Joel Osteen. I hate Joel.
I do hate Joel.
Joel's knowledge of theology is so sophomoric, and his little brain is so small that if you put it in a bee, the bee would fly backwards. I'm sorry if you like Joel Osteen. I apologize, but Joel has zero education in theology. How did he get his job? His daddy was a preacher. Not a terribly good one in my opinion. But Joel ran lights and sound for his daddy. He dropped out of college. And then when daddy died, Joel took over. And, he seems to be an amiable adult. Right? He's got big teeth, pretty wife.
I hate that shit.
But Joel, today I will be taught the word of God. Really, Joel? This gospel of prosperity, what we call the gospel of wealth that you preach, is complete and utter. It has no basis in what we would recognize as solid theological grounding. For example, I was listening to Joel one day as I'm sitting there getting madder and madder and madder and madder. Joel, if you don't have it, That's God saying you don't need it. You may pray to God, and if you don't have it, God is telling you you don't need it. Well, Joel, why don't you go with me down to the Wynn's house, where we have, somebody who's addicted to crack and has sold her body and has gotten HIV and has now passed that on to her child. And why don't you tell them they don't need, because they can't afford the cocktail to keep them alive. That's God's, that is bullshit, right? It is the epitome of evil, in my opinion. So if we use religion, the problem is that we're going to have this dispute. Joel thinks he's doing a great job, I'm sure, but I don't. And we're going to have this dispute about whose book are we going to use? Or, well, if you're in Massachusetts, it's going to be the Catholic Bible, and that Bible's different from the Protestant Bible. The Protestant Bible, we think it's all the same, largely is predicated on, they had this when Protestants religions emerged in England, they had this council that came together and came up with something called the King James Version. That's the standard Protestant Bible. The Catholics have a different Bible, right? Now we have the New International Version, the NIV Bible. All different kinds of, whose book are we going to use? This could be problematic, right? So I think the answer is you have to base this on philosophy. Now, what is philosophy and who invented it? Well, in the Western tradition, I would say that the Greeks invented philosophy, and this is a question. Why did the Greeks invent it? Why did the three greatest minds in the Western intellectual tradition all happen about the same time in ancient Greece? We have these anomalies. In business, we see them. When I was a kid growing up, the three wealthiest men in America were Sam Walton, Dan Tyson, and J.B. Hunt. They all came to prominence at about the same time in a little community surrounding Bentonville, Arkansas. What is it? Was there something in the water in Bentonville that made them? By the way, Sam Walton was born not in Arkansas. Where was he born? Kingfisher, Oklahoma. Right? Just a few miles north and west of here. What is it that led to this? Well, I've gone to several conferences where they talk about why is the Greeks invented philosophy. And there are lots of theories about this. One theory that I liked is, well, the Greeks had an economic system that was based on slavery. And isn't that just the prime thing to allow people to sit around and think? If you don't really have to work because everybody else is doing the work for you, you can just sit around and think all day. Well, actually, the Greeks didn't have a very extensive slave system. In fact, they knew the economy was very tenuous, and so they stopped allowing for slavery or the expansion of slavery. The way you got slaves in the ancient Greek world was you could even enslave other Greeks. You went to war with another Greek village. They had these Greek city-states called polis, and you went to war, and when you won the war, you enslaved those people. Well, the Athenians did away with that. They can't enslave other Greeks because it's affecting the economic system. And in fact, they knew it was affecting the economic system so much that they really started to limit it, because if you have slaves, then you don't have work for people. There have been many, many, many places where slavery has been far more prevalent than it was in ancient Greece. The South, the antebellum South, had far more slavery and zero philosophical thought coming out of the American South. Another theory put forward that I like is that isn't it just the prime location? It's beautiful. The Aegean Sea, it's this great temperature. The sun shines there almost all the time. The sunshine theory, I love this theory. You combine that with slavery, you've got this beautiful scenery and lots of slaves to do the work, and isn't this just really more more sun than ancient Egypt, which had zero philosophy coming up. Okay? So why is it that the Greeks invented philosophy? Well, Professor Daniel Robinson of Oxford, who I tend to think is a brilliant person, he's dead now, says that the reason that the Greeks invented it is because they didn't have an adequate theology. The Greeks had this mythology, and if you look at the mythology, it's not a terribly comforting religion, and it doesn't answer these three questions adequately. It doesn't answer the question of knowledge and conduct and governance. In fact, the Greek gods are in many respects bad characters, right? How did the Greek mythology is predicated on the king of the gods, whose name is Zeus, but how did Zeus become king of the gods? Huh?
He had a lot of kids.
Well, he did. He had sex with a lot of people too. So you have these demigods that were born of a god having carnal relations with a human. But how did Zeus become king? He killed his father, who was the older god, Kronos, right? And frees. So the older god, the older head god, thought his children might take over his power, and so he swallowed them. This is horrible, isn't it? I mean, this is a horrible story. So Zeus kills the older gods. That's how. So gods can die. This is not. If that's the kind of religion you have, and these people are coming down from Mount Olympus, these sort of superhumans are coming down, and they're having affairs with humans and producing demigods. That's not the kind of thing that answers these three great questions, right? So I think that's one of the reasons that the Greeks invented philosophy. Who was the first fully worked out? There may have been somebody before Plato, but the first fully worked out system of philosophy comes from Plato and Socrates. We know about Socrates from his most famous student and also from a poet named Xenophon. There are two sources for our knowledge of Socrates. Socrates never wrote anything down. He would not get tenure. One of the most brilliant minds in the Western tradition would not get tenure as a college professor today because he never wrote anything. He just walked around, talked to people, asked tough questions. And his most famous student says, well, all I did was I followed Socrates around and I wrote down what he said. So the Platonic philosophy is embodied in a series of works. The fully first complete work that works things out is called Republic. You should know that. An exam, Republic. And this is a complete work in that it answers all three of these questions. What is it I can know and how can I know it? What is the correct source of conduct? It is a moral philosophy embodied in Republic. And we get a system of governance embodied in Republic. And I am out of time, so I will stop there. We will pick up with this on Thursday. We're a little bit behind, and then we'll move into modern moral theory, which is what most students like, or the part that they like the most. And then we'll talk about corporate social responsibility.